It's no secret that healthcare costs are going up, and less people are able to keep up with the growing costs. The two most common talking points on addressing these issues are tinkering with former President Barack Obama's landmark Affordable Care Act or a move towards the Medicare for All system, which are good discussions and debates to have on how do we as a country achieve universal healthcare at affordable costs. I wanted to take a different approach that aren't often talked about on ways to lower healthcare costs. So I reached out to 3 different people who I thought had interesting takes on lowering our costs. I talked to investigative reporter David Dayen, financial economist Austin Frerick, and macroeconomist Dean Baker. First up is David Dayen, as we talk about concentration in the healthcare market and how it affects consumers. I hope you enjoy. Thank you.
So you've written a lot about healthcare consolidation. Could you explain a little bit on how that's affecting the average consumer's cost?
Sure. So the Affordable Care Act was a trigger for a lot of healthcare consolidation, but it really just sort of extended a trend that we've seen throughout all sectors of the economy over the last, I'd say, 30 or 40 years. And it's certainly present in healthcare. And it's an interesting kind of dynamic because when you're talking about healthcare, you're talking about multiple sides of a transaction, whether you're talking about the insurance companies who are the payers or the providers who are the recipients of those payments, whether it's hospitals or drug companies or medical device companies, whoever's actually providing the service, and then the insurance companies who are actually paying for that service. And both of those sides are interested in having leverage in a negotiation over payment. So the insurance companies want as broad a pool of subscribers as possible because they want to be able to say to the provider, we can grant you 5 million, 10 million, 20 million customers, but you have to give us a break on price, a volume discount. And similarly, healthcare providers want to have as wide and broad a pool of customers as possible to get leverage on their side of the negotiation. And so you see what I would call concentration creep on both sides. As the insurers consolidate, the providers want to consolidate on the other end because each one wants to get a leg up in that ultimate negotiation. The other dynamic here is that, particularly when you're talking about hospitals, it's a regional issue. There may be 10 or 200 or 1,000 hospitals across the United States, but that's not available to the average person. They really can only visit a select number of them in their community. So if you can corner that market, then you can dictate price over a small community because you own all of the provider outlet. And so that's been the case. There's been significant hospital consolidation. There's been significant outpatient consolidation when you're talking about like the dialysis outpatient industry is mainly controlled by 2 companies. That's just one example. One thing that we're starting to see is a more vertical integration where you have the insurance companies now buying up, in the case of Aetna, buying a pharmacy, CVS, which is another provider and another step along that supply chain. You have United Health buying up the assets for urgent care from DaVita, so they're now getting into the provider business, and of course they can sort of prefer that their customers go to that facility as part of their network in their insurance, and so that's a way to consolidate that business. And you're seeing this more and more as you go from just consolidating your own industry to then moving into other adjacent markets throughout healthcare. So healthcare is one area where we have a serious concentration problem. I've really only scratched the surface because I didn't even get into pharmaceuticals, which is a whole other matter. It's a tremendous problem.
One of the things that I've seen you write about recently, pharmaceutical benefit managers. Could you explain exactly what those are and what the problem with them are?
Absolutely. So pharmacy benefit managers, or PBM, are middlemen that sort of sit in the middle of a health plan and a pharmacy distributing medications, and on the third side of this market, the drug companies and manufacturers themselves. So they originated sort of in the 50s and 60s and said, we have experience with paperwork. Hey, you health plan, you don't provide a prescription drug benefit, but if you do, we can handle the negotiation with the drug manufacturer, and we can also handle the reimbursement to the pharmacy. So we'll negotiate low prices for your customers, and when the pharmacy actually pays out the bill, we will reimburse them. So as you can imagine, as I've described it, this is a multi-sided market. You're talking about three different nodes of this supply chain: the drug manufacturers, the health plan, which are like the insurance plans, or a union health plan, or a government health plan like Medicare and Medicaid, and you have the pharmacy, and the PBMs sit in the middle of all of those players. And they're the only ones, and this is the problem with PBMs, they're the only ones who really know the true price transparency of what is going on. They're the only ones who know everything about that market, what rebates they're getting from the manufacturers, what they're reimbursing the pharmacies, and what rebates actually are, flowing to the health plan customers. And they make their money essentially off of that information advantage, being able to extract more and more off the top of every prescription drug sale. And we'd actually know this through stats, through their own public company filings, that PBMs have been making more money over the last several years per prescription. This is just billions of dollars off the top of every prescription. Now, it's also the case that the PBM industry is very concentrated. There are three PBMs, a CVS, which also owns a pharmacy and might be part of an insurance company very soon, Express Scripts, which is also being purchased by an insurance company, and Optum, which already is purchased by an insurance company, United Health. Those three PBMs control about 80 to 85% of the entire market. And so not only are they able to maximize this price advantage and skim off the top, harming not only the health plans, but really harming pharmacies who don't know when they type in a prescription drug sale how much they're going to get reimbursed for it. Can you imagine if you're, selling at a lemonade stand and you don't know how much the lemonade is going to cost until you make the sale? You might be making that sale at a loss. That is the reality for pharmacies in this country, particularly the small independent pharmacies, because the PBMs, not only do they exhibit what is known as spread pricing, where they claim one amount back to the health plan and claim another amount that they're getting to the pharmacy, and then they make money off that spread. They also claw back some of the reimbursements that they give to pharmacies based on criteria that in some cases are hopeless for the pharmacies to actually affect. This is just a printing money machine that the PBM market is able to engage in. There is very little transparency in terms of all the players knowing where the money goes. It allows for a lot of game playing, and we're starting to see around the country in places like Ohio and Arkansas and California, legislation at the state level to increase transparency, significantly increase regulation and monitoring of these markets, and make sure that when a health plan enters into an agreement with a PBM, that the PBM is actually acting in the best interest of that health plan instead of ripping them off. There's a lot more to this. I did a pretty long article in the American Prospect magazine called The Hidden Monopolies That Make Money Off Your Prescription Drugs. That's not the exact title, but it's close to it. You look it up, look something like that up with my name and you can find it. This is a major driver. Everybody talks about the pharmaceutical companies jacking up these prices. PBMs definitely play a role in the fact that we have some of the highest prescription drug prices in the world.
What could we do about PBMs? Is it an antitrust issue, or is it a transparency issue, or is it kind of both?
Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot you can do. Certainly when you have three companies that control about 80% of the market, and then you have the vertical integration where you're going to have a PBM that owns a pharmacy and an insurance company and then gets to look at all that data and know all of the pricing. You have CVS Caremark has deals with other pharmacies But CVS, the pharmacy, gets to see the information in those deals, and they can undercut the competition. That's an antitrust problem. That's something I don't think the CVS Aetna deal should be allowed to go through, and I do think that we should have a retrospective study of mergers that were allowed to go through to create the oligopoly that we have today in the PBM market, and that should be seriously looked at. And if it does look like anti-competitive behavior, then broken up. But also there is this potential regulatory aspect, and that's kind of what I was talking about. For example, in California, there's a bill to make PBMs fiduciaries. And all that means is that if they have a contract with a health plan, whether an insurance company or a union health plan or a government health plan, that they are obligated under law to act in the best interest of that plan when they make the decisions that they make. So that's an example of something you can do that would improve that market. And then, transparency in terms of printing the actual prices so that everybody knows what the deal is, making sure that all rebates are disclosed and moved on to the health plan rather than kept back for the purpose of profit for the PBM. There's a number of things you can do.
So as you heard from David Dayen, that as the healthcare market merges more and more, prices for consumers go up and choices go down. Bringing transparency and a thorough review of damages caused in the mergers are, as he stated, a good step towards addressing this particular issue. Next, I spoke with Austin Frerick, who wrote a paper in 2016 about corporate pharmaceutical charities and how they rise drug prices to milk Medicare and get tax write-offs at the same time. Back in 2016, while you were working in the Obama administration in the Treasury Department, you wrote a paper on pharmaceutical corporate charities. What was that exactly about? Can you explain that?
Yeah, so it started, actually, I read an article in Bloomberg Business Magazine about how this huge growth of these pharmaceutical charities. So I was like, well, we have access to the data. Let me dig in a little bit. And what you essentially have is like 4 or 5 pharmaceutical companies now do about a quarter of all American corporate charity. And it's like, So I dug into the data, and the way it works is any company can deduct up to 10% of their taxable income if they do charity stuff. Most companies do 1%. Your like car companies or your grocery stores might do 3 or 4. And that's usually like, you go to Walmart, you see those big checks on the wall. It's a little bit PR. But these companies all kept doing 10%. They were all at the cap, and they were actually doing more. So, kept digging in, like, there's something weird going on here, because this just isn't, there's something not right here. And so what we realize is there's 2 different types of charity pharmaceutical companies do. One is essentially they give drugs to the poorest people. 2 is that way they can essentially put the price higher, and then they write it off as charity. But it's kind of like the department store Kohl's, where you go on the Kohl's, you see the shirt says it's $50, but it's always 40% off or whatever. Yeah. They write off their taxes as if it was $40. So they're getting this, like, instead of paying taxes, they're getting this huge tax deduction. So that's actually something I'm working on now, is proposing, well, let's actually make them like the true price at 40% off price, because no one pays sticker price. But the bigger thing we notice with the charity is that what they're actually doing is they're essentially, the way Medicare Part D works, and that's the prescription drug program for older Americans, you are capped at 5% of your copay. So whatever your drug costs, you can't pay more than 5% of the cost. So for like hepatitis C, which is predominantly in older Americans, because a lot of them, they got the disease because of like blood not being screened, that's $80,000 for the cure, 12-week cure. It was a huge scientific breakthrough. So that's still $4,000. But what essentially these pharmaceutical companies have done is they donate $4,000 to a charity that pays your $4,000 for the drug. So then they get $76,000 from Medicare. So they're essentially milking Medicare. And there's no, the sky's the limit on what you can charge.
Okay, so how do you exactly qualify for a tax deduction? Is there like a certain amount that you have to donate to qualify for a percent?
No, anyone can. So any company, like if I run a juice company and I want to give away free juice to the food pantry, I can give them juice and you can write it off as a charity tax deduction, a portion of that, what that juice is worth. So what these companies are doing is they're doing 2 things where they're literally taking drugs and giving free drugs. There's like that one model, but then the other way is they give cash. And so you can write off that $4,000 you give to a charity for cash. So instead of paying taxes on that $4,000, you're writing it off.
Okay, and so the max they can deduct is up to 10%. They can't go any higher. There's no sky's the limit.
No, but they're trying to. You've seen some of their lackeys in Congress have introduced legislation to raise it to like 15, 20. So it's clear, like, based on the data, a lot of them are just going way past that 10%.
So even after they go past that 10%, do they still get, because right now it's capped at 10%. So you're saying they're still going over it looks like.
but they're not getting anything more. So that sounds like it's kind of in an odd way benefiting consumers here.
Well, think of it, the Medicare Part D, the hepatitis C example. Like, you literally donate $4,000 and you get $76,000 from the government. Like, at that point, that's why they could have charged $20,000, but because, you spend a little and you get a lot, it's such a high return. Like, that's why they're willing to go past that cap. Because it's so lucrative, and what that means for Medicare is essentially bankrupts Medicare. It just sucks them all the money down. This cure, this hepatitis C cure, was the number one expensive drug for Medicare, I believe all of 2015. But what's happening too, though, is, so it's good for old people, but actually the prison population has a really high hepatitis C rate because, injection needles. But like a lot of state prisons are like, we don't want to spend $80,000 curing prisoners of hepatitis C. So you're seeing a lot of states, like I believe Louisiana, they're essentially they're only given to a handful of people. What this does is you're bankrupting Medicare and you're stopping a lot of people who need this cure from getting it.
You mentioned this is sort of a problem with Medicare Part D and how it was designed. Can you explain exactly what happened here with Medicare Part D?
Yeah, so I should also say, part of why this is complicated stuff. I mean, it's not easy to get, and that's what the pharmaceutical industry does so well. I mean, they are one of the most corrupt entities in America because they play, like this stuff is complicated. People just want their drugs. But the biggest thing for Medicare Part D is they can't negotiate. Ideally, Medicare Part D has the negotiating power. They can just say, we're not paying that. That's ridiculous. We know what you're doing. Back off. We were instead of paying 80, we're just going to pay, we think it's worth 20. But they can't do it because the drug lobbyists, when this legislation was crafted under George Bush in 2006, they purposely stopped Medicare from doing that. So the pharmaceutical companies they can do whatever, they can just milk the heck out of the program.
So before Medicare Part D got introduced, Medicare wasn't paying for drugs?
No. I believe it wasn't. That's why they added Part D was prescription drug costs started soaring at that time. And so a way to kind of reduce because, senior citizens have they vote, they show up. And so to kind of help reduce those costs on them, they did that. But that essentially means it's just this huge surge in what the government spends on this kind of stuff.
So it sounds like a lot of this is just straight up corporate greed here. But it also sounds like, in a way, it's also benefiting consumers. So would it be fair to say that it benefits the consumers in the short term and then hurts them in the long term?
I think that's the best way to say it, Austin. I mean, short-term, older Americans who need the hepatitis C care get their drug. Long-term, it bankrupts Medicare because it just sucks out all this money and stuff. And then on top of it, you have a prison population that's just not getting treatment. And then on top of it, not only are these pharmaceutical companies are milking Medicare, they're getting a charity deduction for doing so. And on top of it, most of them hide their money offshore anyways. So it's just kind of like, for these billionaires or the companies that own it, it's a great lucrative deal for them at our expense.
So what would be your ideas solving this, besides Medicare negotiating drug prices here?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest one. I mean, you do little things where you say you can't use a sticker price, you got to use what the true average price is people pay. So if you give away free drug, I can't say this Tylenol was $100, even though most people pay $2. You say it's $2. Because what you're doing is you're foregoing tax revenue when you let people get away with $100. That's one big thing. And then it's just being more aggressive with pharma. This is just one little instance of pharma playing on the edge. I mean, it's just a classic example of how the corruption within the American healthcare system, it's purposely designed to be complex. Like my mom always told me when I was little is like, people profit off complexity. So you have 10 federal healthcare programs trying to essentially do all this, and there's very little cost controls anywhere. And it's so complicated, and people just the lobbyists are really good at playing in the margins. And this is just an example of that.
So I want to make sure I understand this. So the pharmaceutical industry will create a drug, and so they get the patent for the drug. And so then with that patent, they get to choose whatever they want for the price. There's no sky's the limit, correct?
Yeah, I mean, they think that the biggest return on $1. So ideally, the best drug is something that is on Medicare. Like most of your people that need it are Medicare Part D recipients, because at that point, it is sky's the limit. Where, if you have a drug that's predominantly 20-year-old men, they're not going to have that really good healthcare coverage that guarantees 5% copay cap.
Okay, so they create this drug, then they name the price, and from there, they go to the government and say, hey, we're writing this off, and we're going to hand these out, so they get the tax deduction. So as you're saying, the hepatitis C, the copay could be $4,000. So they give it to I assume a third party, because they can't do it themselves, I imagine?
Yes, I would, and this took me a while to understand. There are two different things. There's the free drugs, and then there's the cash money. The cash money is predominantly from Medicare Part D, where they just pay your copay with cash, and they do it through these independent charities. But there's been numerous instances where it's like they're clearly not independent, where literally it's one company gives one independent charity that tends to be in the same building or run by the same consultants, who only then pay the copays of their drugs. Like, it's comically not independent. But then the other one, the free drug ones, they're able to, like, Pfizer is able to have its own Pfizer charity. And so if, like, Austin, you need some Pfizer drug, they can give it to you. But what that essentially does is it's really bad PR if you have all these people who can't afford the drug. So essentially, by buying off the bottom part of society that can't afford them, you can charge whatever you want. You can charge a much higher price than you could before.
And then you get the tax deduction.
And then you can also act like you did all this, like you look good. You're like, oh, I'm a good corporate citizen.
And then you get the tax deduction for it. And then
both of these you get tax deductions.
So it sounds like you can double dip here. You can do it cash-wise and get a tax deduction, and then donate it wise. Now, I want to follow up on that. Now, are those two separate tax deductions that cap at 10%, or they all fall in the 10% range?
They all fall in the 10% range.
Okay.
So, like, you're right, you could double dip. Like, if, let's say, our magical hepatitis C cure, so I can give cash to the old people, but let's say all the millennial, like, people under 65 who have their employer health care or Medicaid or whatever, you can then, like, give out free drugs that way to the people who can't afford it. Like, you can play this game different ways, and then it all counts towards your 10%. But keep in mind, what you're doing is, I'm sorry, this took me forever to understand. So essentially, you write off $4,000 for the cash, but for the free drug ones, you can write off $80,000. So even though you're doing two different things, you're claiming one's $4,000, one's an $80,000 tax deduction.
Oh, okay. Well, see, that's perfect then. That explains it a lot better.
Yeah, and so, but the $4,000 one, you're not getting as much tax deduction. You're getting a huge windfall. The government's paying $76,000, whereas when you give away the $80,000, they're not paying you for that free drug.
So ideally, you would want them rather just to write off the $80,000 per se, since that wouldn't drain Medicare.
Ideally, you want to rein in both. You really want to stop the Medicare one. That one's just comically corrupt. The other one, you just want to be like, that drug, no one pays $80,000 for that drug. The average person, let's say the average, what your health insurer pays is $13,000. So instead of writing off 80, you can only write off 13,000. That's how you kind of rein in that one. And the other one, you just got to put a stop to.
To quickly recap the discussion Austin and I had, this is an area that is vastly overlooked. As he suggests, allowing Medicare to negotiate with the pharmaceutical companies and forcing these companies to price their drugs at actual cost instead of an artificially inflated value can help extend Medicare's lifeline. Last but certainly not least is Dean Baker. In October of 2016, Dean released his latest book, Rigged, which is about different ways our economy is shaped to benefit the wealthy and hurt the poor. In his book, he has 2 chapters discussing ways to lower healthcare costs. His biggest chapter is on patent reform in regards to drugs and medical equipment, and the other chapter is on creating more competition for our doctors to lower their costs. As we get further into this interview, Dean talks to me in great detail on how you go about implementing this. So, you consistently say that drugs are cheap, but in the U.S., drugs are comparatively more expensive than they are in many other countries. What causes drugs in the U.S. to be more expensive than they are in other countries?
Well, when I say drugs are cheap, I mean they're cheap to manufacture. So it's important to understand drugs, if we just had a complete free market, drugs would sell in almost all cases for very low prices. It's very rare that it's expensive to actually manufacture a drug. Drugs become expensive because we have patents and other protections that allow companies to have monopolies on them. So it's governments that make drugs expensive. It's not inherent that they're somehow expensive. And the United States is kind of unique in this respect because we both have very strong patent law and we don't have any regulation of prices. So if you look at countries in Europe and Canada, they have patents as well. So, most of the drugs that are patented here are patented there. But they also regulate the price through various mechanisms. So we're the only country that gives drug companies a monopoly and then tells them to charge whatever they feel like. In the other countries, they might give them a monopoly, but then they say, well, you could only charge X. And that typically means prices that are somewhere in the order of 50%, depending on the country, depending on the drug. It could be a little more, a little less. But if you take the average, it's somewhere around 50-55% of the price that we pay for drugs.
For some years now, you've been pointing out one of the primary reasons for high drug prices is, just like you said, the practice of drug patents. What would be your ideas on lowering drug prices as it relates to patents?
think the patent system is a particularly bad way to finance drug research. There's drug innovation. There's issues about patents more generally. So, you could look at patents in the case of tech sector. Apple and Samsung had this seesaw every time one of them came out with a new iPhone or new Galaxy. They'd be hit with patent suits from the other one. And that was going on for, I don't know, 2 or 3, 4 years. You don't want companies competing over their ability to win patent suits. You want them to compete over the product. So there are issues that arise in other areas, but probably nowhere as bad as with drugs. First off, because drugs are essential for people's health and often their life. So it's, you in effect give a drug company, put them in a position of saying, well, do you want to live? How much are you prepared to pay? And needless to say, if people have the ability to pay or get their insurer to pay, they're willing to pay almost anything for a drug that they think will extend their life. So you're giving this incredible power to drug companies that, again, it's not a market story. It's the government doing that. It's a very, very perverse situation. And also you get all these side effects. Again, these are just very straight economics textbook sort of stuff. When you have a huge gap between the price they could sell the drug for and what it costs them to produce it, they have enormous incentive to try and sell it as widely as possible. So that means marketing it for uses where it may not be appropriate, and this is a huge problem, and it's not like something I've made up. Every doctor, every researcher is well aware of it, that drug companies often try to market their products inappropriately. And even worse, there's often cases where they conceal evidence that a drug could be harmful or less effective than advertised because, again, there's so much money at stake. And then on top of that, just as a matter of trying to advance both medicine and science, they don't disclose. They only disclose the information they feel will help them market their drug. They don't disclose their test results because they don't want to give that information to their competitors. And that would be very helpful both for doctors in knowing what's the best drug, because drugs, even saying the drug's safe and effective, some drugs are going to be more effective for some people than others. They might be more effective for women than men. They might be more effective for older people than younger people. There might be side effects for people who have heart conditions. And it might not be the case that the drug company is necessarily concealing it. They may not know. But they haven't thoroughly analyzed the data. If you had made all the data public, then researchers would be able to analyze it, and they would be able to determine which are the best drugs for which people. But with the patent system, they have no incentive to do that. So you end up, it's just a really, really bad way to finance research, and it creates this absurd situation where you have drugs that are cheap to produce end up being very, very expensive to the patients who need them for their health.
So I wanted to explore patents a little bit here so I can better understand what you're talking about. So you're talking about how drugs are cheap to make. So at what stage of the development of a drug is a patent acquired?
Well, it varies, and often drugs have many patents. So, typically, usually companies err on the side of having more patents rather than less. So they're doing research and they have some, they've developed a new molecule, they've altered a gene. They're likely to patent that as soon as they think it has any real promise for medical uses. I mean, sometimes for other uses also, but, in terms of drug development, they'll patent as soon as they think there's serious likelihood of having promise. It may be many years later till they actually have a finished drug on the market. But they don't want to take the risk that they're doing this research, and oftentimes, obviously, there are other people who are doing comparable research, so they don't want to take the risk that they're going to be doing the research and then some other group of researchers is going to beat them to it and have a patent on it. So basically, they're going to look as soon as they think they have something that has potential, and oftentimes they'll be patent things that end up being totally worthless, but as soon as they think something has potential, they're going to want to get down there and patent it.
So I want to back up for a second there on what you're just talking about. So you can put a patent on a molecule? Put
a patent on a molecule. You can put a patent on a gene. this is another issue that the United States is somewhat of an outlier on, that in many other countries they have higher standards for patents, so it's much harder to get a patent. You have to demonstrate both that something's novel and that it has a use. And oftentimes you could have cases where people are patenting genes. They have no idea what use it might have, but they want to get the patent because they think it could be useful to them at some point in, some sort of treatment, and they don't want to take the chance that, someone will beat them to the punch. So we have much, much wider latitude in granting patents. There was a case, there was a patent in, it was 1998, in any case, not ancient history, but not last year, where a company got a patent on a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, which I mentioned just to point out that, our patent office has been incredibly lax. Now, there have been efforts to tighten that up, and there was a law passed, I think in 2011, I won't swear by the exact year, it could have been 12, could have been 10, but it was called the American Invents Act, that allows for a post-patent non-judicial review. So you could always, if say you have a patent on some particular drug, and I don't think it's a valid patent because it was already someone else invented it. It was a trivial change, this and that. I could go ahead and challenge it. I could, go ahead and produce the same drug and say, "Oh, go and sue me," and then for my defense say, "Well, that patent never should have been issued." So I could do that. That's an expensive and risky proposition. What the American Invents Act does is create a post-patent review process where I could say that doesn't make sense for you to have that patent. It wasn't a novel innovation. You just patented something that had been in the public domain for decades. You can't do that. So that has been the basis for throwing out a number of patents in the last, say 5 or 6 years. So that's, to my mind, an improvement. I mean, it doesn't get to the basic structure, but it does eliminate some number of frivolous patents, which, to my view, is a very good thing.
When you're given a patent on a drug or a molecule, as we were just talking about, what period of time is that legally binding for?
It's funny, and I believe it's 20 years from the date of issuance. It used to be, 20 years from the date of application. It used to be 17 years from the date of issuance, and that was changed. That's actually in the TRIPS legislation that was part of the WTO in 1995. So the U.S. was actually pushing that. I mean, it wasn't that. It was changed against our will, but we end up changing the law. It ends up being pretty much equivalent, and there was some kind of nonsense in the transition. But but in any case, point difference between issuance and application, of course, is the application could take a period of time. And, so 17 years from date of issuance could be more or less than 20 years from the date of application. There's also provision in the TRIPS that in the event that there's unnecessary delays, extraordinary delays, you could actually have it extended. So the norm is 20. If, let's say, for some reason it takes 5 years to get your patent approved, then the company could get an extra 2 years on their patent.
Once a patent expires on a drug, so let's say, after 20 years, can they repatent it, or is it just on the market now?
Well, this is, again, an area that has been highly contested. They can't repatent it per se, but what's very, very common is for drug companies to get, and I'm forgetting the right term for it, submarine patents, where they take out patents on things that are part of the drug, but maybe not a key part. So they'll typically have, if there's a molecule that's, the key issue in the drug, they'll have that patent, and that's, they'll get their 20 years. But there could be other aspects of the drug that they could get patents on. And this is where many of these patents are very often dubious. But what, and this is particularly true if you have a big drug company, what they might hope is that they can intimidate generics by saying, "Oh, no, you can't introduce this generic because we have a patent on whatever." And it might be a very dubious patent, but they know, if they're up against a Merck, a Pfizer, one of the big drug companies, that they could end up in court forever. And it's important to understand there's a fundamental asymmetry between a generic and a brand drug when they're in this sort of battle, because the generic company is fighting for the right to sell the drug at the generic price, whereas the brand company is fighting for the right to be able to sell the drug at the monopoly price. So to take, it's somewhat extreme, but not too extreme, you could well have a case where a drug at the brand price is $1,000 per prescription. A drug at the generic price could be $100 or less. The brand company has much more incentive to fight the new entrant, the generic entrant, than the generic entrant has to fight the brand company. So if they think that, the brand company is going to fight it out, they may well back out and just go, okay, forget it. We won't get involved in this. It is also important to point out, even for generic, their costs, so I was saying drugs are cheap, and that's true, but there's still startup costs. You still have to have the FDA approve your generic. I mean, you can go in there and go, hey, our generic's the same as the brand drug that you approved, but you still have to show the FDA that, this is the chemical, this is the active ingredient in the brand drug. We have the same active ingredient. They examine that. They examine your manufacturing process, and then they give you the green light, and they say, okay, you can go ahead and produce it. But that still has costs, so it's not zero cost. It's just an awful lot less than, say, developing a whole new drug. But if you're worried both that, that you could lose the suit, but even if you don't lose it, you might spend a huge amount in legal fees contesting it, you may well just say, okay, if you're going to play that way, we'll just forget it and focus on something else.
Can patents be ignored?
Well, not in the United States. I mean, you're likely to pay really big penalties. I mean, it's, in fact, you in principle could be assessed punitive damages. So it's not just, say, Pfizer has a drug that they're charging $1,000 per prescription for. I put out my generic that I could sell for $50. Well, their actual damages, how much money they lost, how much less did they sell, or how much less money did they take in because I was producing my generic even though they had under patent. So that would be their actual damages, but they could also assess punitive damages because, I knowingly violated their patent. If I didn't knowingly violate it, they could still try. They'd have a harder time. But if I knowingly violated their patent, they're able to get punitive damages. So you probably don't want to do that. Now, you can get around it by going to other countries. So U.S. patent law just applies in the U.S. As I said, we tend to have the most lax patent law in terms of allowing all sorts of things to be patented here that can't get patented in other countries. So in that sense, and people do this to some extent, I wish they did it more, if, we have a drug that's very expensive here because it's patented, and it's not patented, say, in India, where they have, whether you want to say tighter or looser, it's harder to get a patent in India, then, someone could go to India and get the drug at a fraction of the price and get around our patents. So that's a way you could sort of ignore it. I mean, I know that you have to go to India to do it, but, you can get some drugs that are not patented in India that are patented here. Other countries as well, but India is the most important.
Now, could I go to India, as your example is, buy these drugs that are all generic and then bring them back here?
It's a big area of dispute. Generally, if you do it for your own use, the general rule has been there's no issue. So if you're a cancer patient, and these are real numbers, you have some cancer drugs could easily cost in excess of $100,000 a year for a year's treatment. You can get in India for maybe a few hundred or $1,000 or something. You could bring that to the U.S. and have it for your own use. If you were to do that as, say, a wholesaler, that would be violating their laws. And they have tried to crack down on people that have done that.
Earlier you had mentioned that once someone acquires a patent, they can charge whatever they want. There's no law saying, you have to keep it within reason.
Well, it's interesting, actually. The Bayh-Dole Act, which is really key in this, the Bayh-Dole Act is 81 or 82, I think 82, but I won't swear to that. That facilitated the process of commercializing government research. So the government finances a huge amount of research to the National Institutes of Health. And prior to 82, 81, there wasn't sort of a regular process whereby that research could be commercialized. So what Bayh-Dole did was said that the drug companies could basically get patents, get possession of patents based on government research, and pretty much do what they want. And I'll qualify that because it has language saying, and I don't have the text in front of me, so this is very much paraphrasing, saying that they have an obligation to make the products from the research available. So most typically, NIH is not actually developing a drug; they're doing more basic research. Although they have developed drugs, AZT was developed by NIH, so they have developed drugs. But most often, it's more basic research. So the idea is drug companies can use the fruits of that research and then market it. But there is wording to the effect that the government has the right to ensure that they're making it available at a reasonable price. And again, I don't remember the exact wording, so I'm very much paraphrasing, but there's wording something like that. They've never once used that power. So you've had a lot of groups that have tried to pressure them to require drug companies to lower their prices or issue licenses. So one issue that comes up in many contexts is that even though they could have a patent, you could have what's called a compulsory license, where you say, okay, you still own the patent, but anyone who wants to can use it. They have to pay you a fee, say 5% of the sale price. Now, drug companies would be very unhappy with that because 5% of generic price isn't going to be very much money. But they can, in principle, do that, but they've literally never done it. So Bayh-Dole, again, I think it was 82 has passed. It's now 36 years. There's not a single example that I know of, and I think I would know if there was an example because I won't be citing it, where a drug company has been forced through the wording of the law to lower their price.
So we're talking about patents being ignored. I want to actually bring up an example here because I'm trying to understand this. So the EpiPen, for an example, has 4 different patents on it. But the FDA just announced recently that they're going to go ahead and make a generic of it, even though they don't expire until 2025. So how is that working? There's 4 patents on it, but now we're making a generic of it.
But the point to understand, I don't know the specifics of what the FDA has approved, but the active ingredient in EpiPen, I'm forgetting what it's called, but that's been around for decades. So there is no patent on the active ingredient. What they've taken patents on is the delivery device. And, you could have comparable delivery devices that presumably get around the patent. So I presume that that's what they're looking at. Because, again, the ingredient itself is way past, I don't know if it was ever patented, but in any case, it's been the public domain for decades. So there's nothing about the ingredient itself that, is patented, or has an active patent, I should say. What's patented is the delivery device, and again, it wouldn't surprise me. It's a good example if they have 4 different patents on it. So, it may well be the case that they're all very weak and they could all be contested. But the other thing is, it may well be possible to have a comparable delivery device that gets around their patents. So I assume that that's what they're doing.
So often when I hear drug companies argue that the reason why they have these pills so high, the medicine, these drugs so high, is because they spend millions of dollars in researching these drugs, and some of these things that they research don't even make it to market. They just fail. And that's why they're rewarded with this patent, and that's why they charge these prices. And you argue in your book that we should be rearranging the system. Do you have an alternate solution to that?
Yeah, there's certainly some truth to what they're saying. They do spend a lot of money on research, and if they didn't charge high prices, they wouldn't be able to get it. Now, do they have to charge as high as they charge in the U.S.? I'd argue probably not. But in any case, there is some truth to that. That's why they pay for the research. But what I argue is, rather than trying to, in effect, recover the research costs from people who are sick and dying, why don't we just pay for the research up front? And then we could have the drugs be cheap. So I was mentioning before, the National Institutes of Health, we give them I think it's now $32 billion a year. I don't know the exact number, but it's close to that, to undertake research. Now, as I said, most of that's more basic, but they do sometimes develop drugs. They do sometimes pay for clinical trials. So, it's not as though this is something that we're totally unfamiliar with. They've been doing this for decades. So you could expand the funding, and, what I would argue is I probably wouldn't want NIH. Most of what NIH does is not directly at NIH anyhow. They have a campus just outside Washington, D.C. that maybe accounts for a quarter of their research. Most of it's contracted out, usually with university researchers. But in any case, what I would envision is suppose you double or triple that amount and look to replace the industry, the patent-supported research, and you do that, you contract out. I mean, if you contract out with the same companies, you contract out with Pfizer. I mean, most of the research actually, or at least important research, is done by startups, but whatever. You contract out with them, but the condition of getting the money is, one, all your findings are in the public domain, meaning that, if you had some breakthrough in the lab, you write that up and put it on the web as soon as practical. And two, whatever's patented is also in the public domain. So everything that comes out of your research is available at generic prices from day one.
If everything's in the public domain, why would there be a need for a patent?
Well, the logic of the patent would be defensive in the sense that if you still have both other companies in other countries that have the patent system, you don't want to let them be in the situation. You want to be in a situation where you've paid for all this public research and then someone else comes along and patents it, basically takes your research and now says, okay, now we own it. So, I wouldn't mind in the context where we had full public funding for drug research, basically getting rid of drug patents, but that's a bigger step. So what I would see is if you're paying for the research, you patent everything, put it in the public domain, and actually what I would do, there's a concept from the free software movement, copy left, flipping over on copyright, it's called copy left, where you say you patent it and anyone could use it as long as they themselves have it in the public domain. So say the government paid for this research that develops a new, asthma treatment, that's better than EpiPen. So I go, wow, that's fantastic. Let's work on that and get a good delivery system that's, better than the EpiPen or something. Well, I could go ahead and do that as long as everything I do is in the public domain. But if I say, oh no, I'm going to get patent on it and charge big bucks, well then they can come back at me and say, wait a second, it's copy left. So if you want to be able to do that, you got to talk to us. And then they make it so that it's not going to be profitable for me to try and charge big bucks.
How much money do you estimate we could be saving by switching our system for generic drugs?
Well, the way I think about it, there's sort of two different parts of the story. One is just if we snapped our fingers and we said, okay, we got rid of all patents and related protections, and there's other protections like data exclusivities, there's other things that come up. But if you got rid of all those protections, we're currently spending somewhere around $430 billion. I have a higher number in my book because they've revised the data downward. But we're spending somewhere around $430 billion on prescription drugs. It's more than a guess. My guesstimate, based on, looking at what generics sell for, is we probably spend less than 20% of that if everything was generic. So that means instead of spending, let's say, $430 billion, we'd spend $80 billion. So that's savings on the order of $350 billion a year. It's about 1.8% of GDP. That's real money. Now, as I said before, we also have to pay for research because obviously if you've taken away patents, companies aren't going to do research, or certainly not as much research, since they aren't able to get it back in patent-protected prices. So how much would we have to spend in additional research? The drug companies spend somewhere around $55 billion a year if you look at their numbers. So assuming we have to spend roughly the same amount, we end up netting out somewhere close to $300 billion, so somewhere around 1.5% of GDP. So we still have very, very large savings. And so I consider that the potential, and, again, it's great to have savings of that size, but also, if we think at the end of the day, it's about people's health, to eliminate this horrible fear or concern that many people have that, they have a serious illness and they're going to have some drug that's going to cost them basically everything they have. I mean, they'll try to get their insurer to pay for it. Maybe they will, maybe they won't, or the government if they're on Medicare or Medicaid. That would just disappear. If you had drugs sold at generic prices, it would just be a non-issue. And so I like to give the example of aspirin. I mean, great drug. It makes a huge difference for people. But no one, obviously for a very poor person, anything's expensive. But, certainly no middle class, even moderate income person has to worry about how they're going to have to pay for a bottle of aspirin. And that'd be pretty much the story with the vast majority of drugs if they were all available at generic prices.
In your book, Rigged, that we've been talking about, you talk about patent rents. What exactly is a patent rent?
Well, patent rent is the money that companies make because they're able to have a monopoly in the market. So it's the difference between the generic price, what they would be getting if it were just sold like anything else, it's the free market, and what they get as a result of having this government monopoly, government-granted monopoly.
Okay. So, again, in your book, Rigged, you make the case that patent rents distort the research process for drugs. How is that?
Well, there's two issues here. One is that it may push research into areas where, if we could sort of sit, we were all knowing and we could sit there and look, where would we most like to spend the money to improve people's health? Well, that would be an area where there's not already an effective drug. But because you have patent rents, you have a lot of drug companies that go, wow, look at that. There was this great breakthrough drug in, I'll give you a concrete example of Agra, for erectile disorder, or whatever term they use for that. So they came out with that and they're making lots of money. You had other drug companies jumping into that market. Well, that's not altogether worthless. I mean, in the sense that, it's good to have a second drug. Some people have bad reactions to the first drug or, it's not effective. But it would make more sense to devote research dollars to trying to treat a condition where there is no effective treatment rather than spending a lot of money on, coming up with the second, third, or in some cases fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth treatment with the idea that you'll be able to share some of the patent rents. So that's one way in which it distorts priorities. The other way is simply through secrecy, that, what we would like is to have researchers have full access to available information so that if they're pursuing something that is known to be a dead end, they don't waste resources on it. But because a lot of the research is secret, I mean, the drug companies, they don't have any incentive, so they were trying to pursue a particular way to treat cancer. It turned out not to work. They might have spent a lot of money on that over the years. They're not going to, they could, but in general, they're not going to publish that. They're not going to put that up on their website so that other researchers could see that. They'll keep that secret. They have no particular reason to make that public. So if you had the sort of system I was describing, where anytime you have an interesting result, you're obligated to make that information available in a timely manner, that would be available. So people would know this is a dead end. Don't do it.
You're talking about putting research into a public domain. So we're talking like a website, or are we publishing books here?
Well, presumably both, but these days probably websites are going to be the main mode of communication among scientists, the scientific community. I say that as an economist. I'm not a biomedical researcher, but I mean I do occasionally buy an economics book. But almost invariably, I've seen say if an interesting article comes out, I see it on the web. I might know the person they sent it to me, or they posted themselves on their website, or something to that effect. So most typically I see something on the web long before it's going to appear in print. So, these days I think probably we're talking websites.
We talked earlier about the Bayh-Dole Act. So up until 1980, researchers working on a government contract, all that research was put into the public domain?
It was irregular what happened with it. Generally, yes. But I think there wasn't a uniform set of practices, but I think that was probably in general what would happen. And it's interesting that if you look at the period after Bayh-Dole, there's a big increase in research spending on drugs, which was supposed to be what happened, and of course a big increase in drug spending relative to the economy. So if you look at the amount we spent on drugs relative to the size of the economy, 60s through the 70s, there's not much change. It was around 0.5% of GDP. I'm saying this by memory, so I don't have the exact numbers, but it was somewhere around 0.5% of GDP, and no clear upward trend. So it wasn't increasing. And after 81, 82, it starts to increase very rapidly. And currently it's, over 2% GDP. It's about 2.2, maybe 2.3. So you find, again, I haven't tried to analyze it fully. Perhaps someone else has, but the timing's pretty hard to miss. So it sure looks like Bayh-Dole was the biggest factor there.
What, in your opinion, do you think brought about this Bayh-Dole Act? Why do you think they came up with this congressional piece of legislation?
I haven't studied the dynamics. I assume the drug industry saw this as a gold mine, that, they wanted to have clear access to the government research, and this was the way to get it, and it certainly proved to be the case. But whether they thought that at the time, I really don't know. So I don't want to say that for sure, because again, I haven't tried to study who was involved in pushing it. But let's just put it this way: it turned out very, very well for the drug companies. Now, whether they understood that at the time and that they were big pushers of it, that I don't know.
We've talked about other countries upholding patents, and they would negotiate prices while the U.S. just lets it run wild. But India doesn't seem to honor patents at all. They just have generic drugs. How does India not face repercussions for this?
Well, India does have patents. They had outlawed patents on drugs, the drug themselves, it was back in the 70s, and as part of their development strategy. So you could get a patent on the processes, the mechanical processes in producing a drug, but not on the drug itself. And as a result of that, they have a massive generic industry. I mean, their generic industry is far and away the biggest in the world. And, and it's high quality, so their biggest manufacturers, companies like Cipla, they produce for the whole world, and they're to U.S. standards, so it's not as though they're at all inferior drugs. Under the TRIPS agreement, which they're a signatory, 95 WTO agreement, which includes TRIPS, they were obligated to start having patents on drugs in, I believe it's 2005. Again, I won't swear by the exact year. And they've been doing that. They do have patents on drugs, but they've required them to have a much, much higher bar. So there have been a number of drugs that are subject to patent in the U.S., but they're not subject to patent in India for a number of reasons. I mean, one example is that they don't allow combination drugs. So a lot of the drugs that we give patents on are combinations of, say, 2 or 3 existing drugs. In India, for a drug to get a patent, it has to be a new chemical entity. So there's a number of drugs, as I say, and some of the most expensive, I think Gleevec, a very expensive cancer drug, that's at least hadn't been. I'm not up to date. It's possible Indians recently approved a patent on it, but they had been denying the patent on Gleevec. So it's been harder for companies to get patents there, but they do have them. But they're much more critical before approving a patent than in the United States.
Would you think the United States would benefit from adopting India's plan?
Well, I mean, my first step would be I'd love to see us do things to get drug prices down. But I do think we have to change the patent system in a fundamental way. So India's not thinking about how to finance drug research, because they're taking it for granted that they do obviously do some research in India, but they're taking it for granted that for the most part they're going to be producing drugs that are developed elsewhere. And the U.S. is far and away the biggest elsewhere. So if we want to have new drugs, which presumably we do, then we do need some mechanism to finance them. And again, patents do that. I just would argue it's a really, really bad way to do it. So I'm okay with saying, okay, let's do whatever we can to bring down drug prices, but I do also want us to think seriously like, well, we do want to develop new drugs going forward, so what's the mechanism for doing that?
We've obviously been talking a lot about patents here, and we've been mainly focused on drugs. Are there patents on other materials involving medical equipment?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. And, it's throughout the medical system, and that's why you have a lot of things that seem very mundane. Stents, that those are expensive. Those cost hundreds, thousands of dollars. What does it cost to manufacture them? $1, almost nothing. So it's, medical supplies, medical equipment, scanning devices, MRIs, basically everything. And with very few exceptions, these things, I don't know if you want to use the word cheap, but, you might have an MRI or some other scanning device that could sell for hundreds of thousands, maybe even over $1 million. And that's because it's patented. It's not a single patent. Odds are they have, maybe a dozen, 2 dozen. It could be a large number of patents on it. So it's very much the same story. And if you envision everything was available without patents, maybe it'd sell for 25, 50,000. Again, it's rare that it's really expensive for them to manufacture it. I mean, a lot of the things have to be very finely measured and things like that, so that involves some expense, but that's likely getting you in tens of thousands, not likely getting you into the millions. So it's the same story there. And again, particularly since it is people's health, I mean, I always make the analogy that this is as though we had a firefighter, because the drug companies go, well, you know, you're criticizing us for a high price, but we save people's lives. And go, well, firefighters save people's lives. We don't give them millions of dollars. I mean, you know, they tend to be reasonably well paid, but, you know, we don't have firefighters come to our house and go, you know, you got your 3 kids inside. What do you say? Give me $3 million or they burn. You know, we would think that was absurd, you know, but that's kind of what we're doing with drugs.
We talked a lot about in this interview how patents are one reason costs in our healthcare system are so high. But that's not the only thing that's driving up costs. Doctors, physicians, and specialists, and so on and so forth, are much higher than they are in other countries. You've also written a lot about a way to lower their salaries. Could you explain how we would go about doing that?
Well, the story, I mean, if you look at our per-person healthcare costs compared to Canada, Germany, you know, other countries that have very good healthcare systems, comparable outcomes, and there's a lot of research on that, so I'm not just saying that, you know, because you could find a lot of research. People have tried to compare outcomes. We pay about twice as much on average. Some cases, if you look at UK, which probably is a somewhat inferior healthcare system, we pay about 2.5 times as much. But in any case, we pay about twice as much as, you know, what we might think was the comparable countries. And overwhelmingly, the reason for that is we pay twice as much for every aspect of the system. So I was mentioning drugs, you know, same story with medical equipment, but also our doctors get paid roughly twice as much as doctors in Germany and France and other, you know, comparable countries. And it's very, very hard, in my view, to justify that. Our auto workers don't get paid twice as much. Workers at convenience stores don't get paid twice as much. Why should our doctors get paid twice as much? And, you know, what we've done is we have very strong protectionism for doctors. The key here is that to practice medicine in the United States, with very few exceptions, you have to complete a U.S. residency program. And we sharply limit the number of slots in U.S. residency programs. And we don't accept, so the point here is, you know, if we wanted to have like sort of, you know, free trade in doctors, you know, remove barriers, we would be certifying, saying, okay, in other countries, we want to see that you completed a comparable training program. So do doctors in Germany complete a comparable program? Maybe it's not exactly. So maybe we'd say, okay, you have to do another 6 months, you have to do another year or whatever. But if you do that, then you can come practice medicine in the United States just as if you were, you know, went to school and got your residency in New York or California or something. So I've argued we should be looking to do that. The doctors' lobbies are tremendously powerful, and I could just tell you, having written about this a few times, these guys go absolutely nuts. I've never gotten more, you know, angry, both in volume and tenor, email than writing about allowing doctors to, you know, from other countries to compete. And yeah, I'm saying that having written about, you know, all sorts of bad things about, you know, Wall Street and CEOs and, you know, other people, other groups who, you know, I think are ripping off the country, insurance companies, you know, but never have I gotten so much angry response as saying that doctors should have to compete internationally.
I often hear about the reason that doctors are highly paid is because they have to pay a lot for medical school. That's their argument, is they spend hundreds of thousands of dollars and years of their time studying to become a doctor, and that's why they can charge what they do. Do you have a counter argument to that?
Yeah, well, a couple things. First off, you know, as a resident, they are paid, so they throw that in there. They aren't paid as much as they would like, but residents often get $40,000-$50,000 a year. Now, it's not great pay, but that's more than an awful lot of people. So the idea that they dissolve with no pay, that's not true. Now, they do often come out with debt, and $100,000, $200,000 isn't uncommon. Okay, well, doctors in Germany, France, maybe they'll make $120,000, $130,000 a year. Our doctors get an average over $250,000. 2 years of that, they've made up their $200,000 in debt. So those don't come close to balancing. But I would say, I mean, we don't want, part of the reason if you look at who becomes doctors, it's very much tilted for people from wealthier families, which is bad, both in, you know, we want, you know, the best people to be doctors, but we also don't want to exclude. We don't want people to think they can't go through med school because they don't want to take the risk. They're not from a wealthy family. They don't want to come out of med school with $200,000 in debt because they don't want to have that sort of burden. They don't have parents who could help them out. They don't want to have to worry about that. Totally understandable. So we should be looking to have, free or low-cost med school. New York University, some rich guy, I'm forgetting who it was, actually just put up the money. So New York University is now going to be free, med school. So we should be looking to do that, and deal with the transition. I think that would be fair. I sort of said to doctors is, I do think that would be fair. On the other hand, we haven't done that for other people. So we haven't done that for auto workers that have lost their jobs to international competition or steel workers. So, I do think it'd be fair to cover them somehow with the transition, say a loan reduction program or whatever. It'd be fair to do that. But, just as I say, as a practical matter, we've not done that for other groups, which isn't to say it's good that we didn't do it for other groups. It's just noting that, they're demanding something. If they get some sort of transition like that, they're getting something that most other workers in society have not gotten.
In your book, you mentioned there's like a board that allows a certain amount of doctors to be licensed a year. And you say the board's run by doctors?
Yeah, there are two different issues. One is the certification for specialties, so heart surgeons and cardiologists. So that's generally not legal. I could get arrested if I practice medicine without having been certified as a doctor, which means having passed the U.S. residency program. So that's a legal requirement. The specialties, so cardiologist, that's not a legal requirement. Someone could see me, say I'm a doctor, I've been certified as a doctor, and someone sees me because they want me to check their heart, but I haven't been approved by the board, the state board, for being a cardiologist. That's not a legal issue. I can't get arrested for that. Now, it's possible I could be sued for it because if I present myself as a cardiologist and I actually haven't been certified as a cardiologist, then, I might be, in fact, committing fraud. But that's not, I won't go to jail for that. I haven't violated the law by practicing medicine without a license. But in any case, yeah, that is limited by a board, which typically, it varies by state, but they're typically dominated by the specialists themselves. So the boards that will determine who in the state of Florida can be a cardiologist, odds are that board is almost entirely cardiologist. So yeah, so they have an interest in limiting the number of people who they certify as being cardiologists.
As Dean talked about reforming our patent system and allowing a free market for our doctors to compete in, with doctors from other countries who have well-developed healthcare systems can vastly lower healthcare costs that can be passed on to us consumers. I would like to thank David Dayen, Austin Frerick, and Dean Baker for taking time out of their busy schedules to talk about their ideas on lowering healthcare costs. But I've linked their Twitter accounts where you keep up to date with their work and articles on subjects we've talked about in these interviews. I hope you enjoyed this as much as I did. Thank you.